So, dear and respected friend, thank you so much for joining today's session, today's Swadhyaya Chakra dialogue. And on behalf of Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming, Puducherry and Chennai, I welcome the guests who are virtually present here. I welcome Professor Ori J. Scholtes from Georgetown University, USA. I welcome John Clammer, Professor of Jindal Global University, India. I welcome Dr. Muhammad Maroof Shah, eminent thinker from Srinagar, Orissa. That is a little network problem.
Okay.
So Professor Ori J. Scholtes has some other engagement. So we will ask Professor Giri to give a kind of brief introduction in once Professor Ori J. Scholtes complete his presentation. So I would request Professor Ori J. Scholtes to kindly present his presentation.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you so very much. Ananta, were you going to say something first, or should I just go ahead?
Well, I would just first join our dear Randhir to welcome you, Ori, John, Maroof, Minati, and all friends co-present. And it is a joy to nurture this conversation on Sabbath. And as Abraham Joshua Heschel tells us, that how we are closed within space and we need to open to time, and how Sabbath is really a cathedral in time, and it is not limited by space. And there is a very profound line that the Romans and all the empires, they can destroy a spatial temple, but they cannot really destroy this temporal gathering, which is a very deep assurance that we can always cultivate a moment of sacredness, a rest, and which then becomes a progenitor for a new kind of time and possibility. And in this book also, Abraham Joshua Heschel tells us the limits of technical civilization. And that is so significant because we are now in a moment of civilizational crisis and a civilizational transition, as scholars such as Arturo Escobar and others are telling us. And therefore, in this moment, how do we really cultivate a different mode of temporality? And that time is, I would like to call a pregnant time, a pregnant temporality, and which can really give birth to new kinds of time realizations. And so the deep significance of this work is help us really go through the challenge of civilizational transition. I have a few more, thoughts to share from Abraham, but in the meantime, let us listen to Ori, please. And Ori has to leave within half an hour. So I request Ori to please speak for 20 minutes to begin with, and then we would have conversations with you for 10 minutes, please. Ori.
Fine, and I apologize in advance for the fact that I have to leave. But as Ananta knows, the requests came and I had already other things organized. So very briefly, to begin with, Abraham Joshua Heschel was a theologian, which means, since the Greek word theos means God, and logos means, well, in post-17th century use of Latin, study of. So study of God or study of what people have thought about God is what the word means. So much of his writing focuses on God and seeking a human language for trying to grasp God, because one of the paradoxes of divinity is that it speaks its own language. And we can never really know how effectively we understand what it is saying and how effectively what we say expresses and explores and explains what God is. Since we speak from our own language, our vocabulary is from our own experience. And we don't know, for example, if we say that God is one, or that God is all powerful, or that God is engaged in human affairs, or if God is good or God is merciful. We don't know what those terms mean in God's terms. So language is always an issue. And most of Heschel's life really is engaged in trying to address that issue and to find a vocabulary that will assist us in this wonderful problem of understanding God. He is at one and the same time a universalist. One of his more prominent books, which is called Man is Not Alone, is subtitled A Philosophy of Religion, and the discussion is broad. On the other hand, he is certainly Jewish. He is a Jewish theologian, and much of his writing pertains specifically to Jewish ideas. The companion volume to Man is Not Alone is a volume called God in Search of Man, and its subtitle is A Philosophy of Judaism. So a philosophy of religion, a philosophy of Judaism. We see how his mind encompasses both the specifics of his Jewish understanding, of Jewish ways of understanding God, and his human understanding of human ways of understanding God. Heschel is also somewhat of a mystic, and I say somewhat because the only person who knows whether or not he or she is a mystic is that person. A mystic is either someone seeking a kind of oneness with God, or someone who has succeeded in finding a means of achieving a kind of oneness with God, and only that individual can know. So to refer to someone as a mystic is in and of itself a kind of somewhat, rather than absolute sort of statement. But Heschel is certainly drawn to mysticism as one of the mechanisms, as one of the modes of defining vocabularies of addressing the divine. So not surprisingly, in his work, this wonderful, relatively small essay, The Sabbath, his sources are universal. He talks about Aristotle. They're Jewish. He talks specifically about Torah and about the rabbinic tradition, and mystical. He references the Zohar, the primary text of medieval Jewish mysticism, otherwise known as Kabbalah, but he also references later Jewish mystical traditions, the Hasidic tradition and the like. And in that discussion, by drawing from these different sources, he makes the observation that the Sabbath is about sacred time. And as Ananta pointed out, he contrasts that with the notion of space, that the Jews in Europe, for example, living as a minority within the Christian majority, were witness to magnificent structures, spaces that Christendom developed, the churches and cathedrals that were both large and beautiful and complexly decorated, and symptomatic of an interest in space. And I might point out parenthetically that one of the important ways in which the Israelite Judean tradition separated into Judaism and Christianity was with respect to their respective understandings of God. For Judaism, God remained understood to be without form, without shape, without tangibility, without physicality. For Christianity, physicality became a very important, the most important aspect of God that assumes human and not just physical, but human form to be one of us, to experience what humans experience. So there's a logical and natural corollary to the development of space within the Christian tradition, whereas within the Jewish tradition, perhaps it makes sense that there would be more of an interest, not in space, but in time. And in fact, when one talks, for example, of Jews in prayer, the equivalent structure to a church or cathedral is a synagogue. But the synagogues not only remain modest until in relatively recent times, the last 200 years or so, that's another story, but in part, a Jewish community that establishes itself in a new place will rarely make as its first goal to build a synagogue, because the understanding is we can pray anywhere. We can pray alone, we can pray together. When we gather together, the word for that in Greek is synagoge, to be led together. The Latin equivalent of that word is congregatus. So congregation and synagogue become eventually, in the English versions of those words, terms that respectively refer to the group praying and the structure in which it prays. But both of those terms really refer to coming together to do so. And so the imagery of Heschel's discussion of the Sabbath, which is time rather than space focused, is also rich in an attention to the specifics of Hebrew language, which is one of many languages that distinguishes masculine, feminine in terms of its nouns and its adjectives. English, for example, for the most part does not. We do with humans, male and female. We do with certain animals. We do with certain objects that we humanize. Let's say if I refer to my boat with a female name or my car with a female name, as some people are wont to do, at least in the United States, it's one of our many sillinesses. But for Hebrew, everything is either masculine or feminine. And with that in mind, the word Shabbat happens to be grammatically female. But then so is the word for queen, of course, or the word for bride, or the word for Torah. And it isn't accidental that within specifically and particularly the Jewish mystical tradition to which Heschel alludes, the Sabbath is connected to the idea of a queen, to the idea of a bride, to the idea of the Torah, wrapped around with the concept of love. So one loves the Sabbath as a groom loves his bride, as a king loves his queen. And so Heschel plays with these kinds of ideas. He notes, going back to biblical Hebrew, in fact, that there is no word for thing, for object in biblical Hebrew. The word that evolves so that in modern Hebrew, davar means thing, is a root that means to speak, to say, to enunciate, to express. He gives a whole laundry list that have to do with speaking as opposed to objectification. And indeed, the word Sabbath itself isn't even a noun at the outset. It is based on a verb, shavat, rested. God rested on the seventh day. So it's about an action that we take rather than an object that we grasp or a place that we install ourselves within or try to encompass. In that account in Genesis, 6 days are devoted to the physical creation, and on the seventh day, we see or we read that that God rested. And so within the Jewish concept of time, the Sabbath, which is the seventh day, is the day of rest that follows 6 days of toil. The physical creation is finished by God in 6 days. What's left to fill out the entire rest, not only of the Torah or of the Bible, but all of human literature and history, and not just Jewish literature and history, is the problematic of being a partner with God in the moral and ethical ordering of reality, the moral and ethical creation, not having to involve ourselves in the physical process which was finished by God. There is a sense in which, as Heschel points out, and again, he's drawing from the mystical vocabulary, even more of Christianity than of Judaism, when he references the via negativa, the negative, what we can't say about God, as opposed to what we think we can say about God. So the Sabbath is not only, is filled with an enormous series of what you may not do. You should not labor. You should not do this. You should not do that. That's what we find in the book of Exodus and again in the book of Deuteronomy. But at the same time, the Sabbath is about what one does do, the moral actions in which one is supposed to be engaged, even if one is not engaged in certain everyday actions with which one spent one's time for the first 6 days. There are things one ought not do, one ought not grieve. If I am in mourning on the Sabbath, I delay the continuation of my sense of mourning. I should not engage in what Ananta referenced by way of Heschel as technical civilization, whether it's fire, whether it's driving my automobile, or whether it's using my money, which all of which relates to the kind of technical place-centered civilization against which the Sabbath kind of pushes. This does not mean that the Sabbath pushes against those 6 days as negatives, because as Heschel points out, they are also equal parts of the covenant. In 6 days, you should do your labor. On the seventh day, you should rest. The point is, God commands the Israelites to do both. So the Sabbath is the focus on the soul, and yet it's not an abandonment of this world, as the anecdote that he told of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Rabbi Eliezer points out. They spend 12 years hiding in a cave from the Romans, and when they come out and they see everything going on, they're horrified because they've been apart from the world, and they're horrified by seeing the world, as it were, going on in its physical, technical sort of way. And God itself criticizes them for that overly extreme idea, and they're punished in a sense. They go back to the cave for another 12 months. And it's only when they come out and they feel a balance that they are able to come to peace. And what is the image that provokes that balance? This old man whom they see carrying myrtles in order to celebrate the Sabbath. So the idea of the Sabbath is of rest. It is of separation from the world of the everyday, but it's not about abandoning the world. It is about the soul, but it is also about the body. It is also about pleasure. So what are the things that one may do on the Sabbath? Can I smoke? Nowhere in the Torah is smoking mentioned, but apparently already by the late rabbinic tradition, smoking is something that people do, and it comes to be understood to be something I shouldn't do on the Sabbath. So again, Heschel gives us the story of a rabbi, another rabbi who is in a cave so dark that he cannot see day and night and is worried that he won't know when the Sabbath begins. And then he starts to feel this yearning to smoke. And then he realizes he always, in the ordinary, everyday way of his life, felt that desire to smoke when it was the Sabbath, when he was forbidden from smoking. So he understands two things from that. One, that smoking had come to be understood as something one should not do on the Sabbath. And two, in the case of this rabbi, that it was connected to him, his overcoming of the need and the desire to smoke was part of the paradoxic pleasure he got in being able to overcome himself as an animal that does what it needs to do and cannot do other than what it needs to do physically, but as a human able to overcome needs under the right circumstances. So he realizes when he starts to feel that yearning to smoke, it must be the Sabbath. And so there's this wonderful and intimate relationship between smoking and Sabbath, that one might not expect. Can I play sports on the Sabbath? In some parts of the Jewish world, some spaces within the Jewish world, the time of Sabbath is one in which sports is considered a profane engagement in which I should not be involved. In others, it is understood to be as a pleasurable act, and because the Sabbath is supposed to be pleasurable, not onerous, then I should be able to play sports if that gives me pleasure. So the notion of the love element that is connected to the Sabbath, which Heschel brings up, the Sabbath as a queen, as a bride, and the like, it's love that is both, as he points out, of the chivalric sort, which is a spiritual love. And so the image of the old man carrying the myrtle is an image of love, because the myrtle was the traditional plant that the groom brought to the bride in the wedding ceremony, as Heschel points out. So it is all about love, loving the Sabbath. It's about love, but the fact of the matter is, it's also about physical love. It's about sexual love. There's a passage which Heschel does not quote in the Zohar that talks about the obligation of students of Torah, of rabbis, to have sex with their wives, in particular on the Sabbath, because if they've been apart from them studying Torah for 6 days, this is something in which they should be engaged. So it is about physical pleasure and not just spiritual pleasure. It's about encountering the sacred with precision. The Sabbath starts at a particular moment, precisely at sundown, and by paradox, it ends at an unparticular moment. The celebration of Havdalah, of separation from the Sabbath, comes when you can see 3 stars in the sky. Anyone who's ever looked up at the stars when the evening is coming on realizes that you may see one, and it's usually a planet, Venus, usually, sometimes another planet, the evening star. By the time you can see three, you see many. So it is decisively and decidedly imprecise. And the whole point is to extend the Sabbath, to extend the pleasure of the Sabbath. Part of the celebration of Havdalah involves sweet spices that one sniffs. And the idea is that that smell stays in the hairs of one's nose till the Sabbath is gone, as a symbol of the Sabbath that one continues to celebrate. What is the meaning of the word Sabbath as the Zohar mentions it, as Heschel tells us? It's the name of God. It's the name of God. God that is one, God that is unique, God that is all-encompassing, God that is universal. It is a palace in time with a kingdom for all. What is pleasure? It's about trying to understand what the Sabbath is. We can only understand, we can only describe, we can only explore it through metaphor, through allegory. We've come full circle to the beginning of this circle, the problem of language, of the insufficiency of language in helping us to understand. Can I play sports? Can I smoke? That has to do with how I have understood, what I have interpreted with respect to the revelation. The effort is to find oneself in a time called Sabbath, not a space. In that sense, it bears somewhat of an analogy with the concept of nirvana. If my goal is nirvana, nirvana is not paradise. It's not a place. It's a condition. The Sabbath is not a place. It's a condition. It's a time without time, where in my ongoing effort to understand what it is, I am within a kind of eternal present. There's no past, present, future. And as Heschel notes, when Moses first encounters a sense of Godness, it's out in the middle of the middle of the middle of the middle of nowhere, in spaceless space, a placeless place, where this entity that cannot exist is there, a bush that is burning and doesn't turn to ash. And out of it, he hears, I don't know in what language, a voice. In the language that we get in the Torah of the Revelation, the voice, when Moses says, what are you, who are you, answers, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I am will be that I am will be. The Hebrew form of that verb cannot distinguish present from future, as let's say, for example, English does. It's ongoingness. It implies without beginning, without end. And the concept of the Sabbath is intended to offer a connotation for us in the here and now of that eternal ongoingness that connects us to something beyond ourselves. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. So, dear and respected friend, if you have any question, please indicate me in the chat box. Meanwhile, we can see one question there in the chat box by Sabir Ahmed Bhatt. Sabir Ahmed Bhatt, would you like to ask the question? Please unmute yourself.
Or I can see it in the chat. I can read it out if you wish, Shabir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah, is the Sabbath universal and same in all religions? And if yes, please tell us its forms. And the answer is,
Professor Suriji Soltas, please note it down. We have one more question in our YouTube that is descent is indigenous to Judaism? Is descent is indigenous to Judaism? If yes, then why we don't have that inculcation of dissent in contemporary emergence of right-wing politics? So these are the two questions. So please.
Yes, well, the two questions offer two aspects of one question. So the answer is not every tradition has a Sabbath concept. As Heschel points out, for example, the pagan Roman civilization had no such idea, and it viewed the Judeans and later on the Jews, and then later on, I'll get to the Christians in a moment, the Christians as lazy, because 1 out of 7 days they didn't work. They saw it entirely in negative terms. in the story that Heschel tells, where three rabbis are discussing Rome, and the critic, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's criticism of Rome is they build all these glorious things for themselves. It's only about themselves. So at that time and that place, the Sabbath as an idea, both that one rests every seventh day and everyone and everything, not just me who am the master, but all my servants, all my animals, everything is expected to rest. It's intended to be a positive, it's intended to be rejuvenative, and so on and so forth. That idea that is expressed for the Israelites in the Ten Commandments then evolves into Judaism. It also evolves in Christianity. Christianity initially, in fact, develops two Sabbath ideas because the early Christians are essentially what I would call Judeans for Jesus before the schism becomes complete and we have two very different faiths. So that the early Christians were celebrating the Sabbath, the seventh day, and then Paul said we should add a day in honor of God, the Lord's Day. And that, of course, became what is celebrated on Sunday. Eventually, as the schism became more complete, Christianity began to celebrate Sunday where Jews celebrated Saturday. There would be some groups, for example, the group known as the Seventh-Day Adventists, who said, no, we Christians should be celebrating the seventh day, not the sixth, not the first, rather. So they call themselves Seventh-Day Adventists. When Islam came along, it evolved a sense of Sabbath on the sixth day, Juma, Friday. The most noteworthy feature of Juma is that if there's a time when we can pray as a community at noon, our noon prayers should be done then together in the mosque, in the gathering place, in the masjid, not alone. That becomes the centerpiece. So each of these three Abrahamic traditions has a Sabbath concept. They are not identical by any means. They all have as a centerpiece the notion of being together and praying together as a community. One has similar ideas, but not identical, beyond the Abrahamic traditions as well. So in one sense, it's not universal across history, across time and space. In another sense, as time has moved on, it's a concept that has become more you can find it much more frequently across a diversity of traditions. But I'll just end where I began. In the pagan world, the idea of a Sabbath doesn't exist in the same way. The Babylonians had the idea of Shabbatu, and linguistically the words are the same, but Shabbatu was the idea of a day during the month when it was a bad luck day. You should not do anything. So not doing anything was for a negative reason. The development of Shabbat was not doing certain things and doing certain other things for a positive reason. So that's my short version of a sort of complicated answer to both those questions in a way.
One more question, sir. Just one more question.
Okay.
Josiah Heschel famously remarked that the racism is an eye disease, and it is surely that, but it also a disease of mind, of disease of heart, and a disease of spirit. Heschel himself called cancer of soul. So my
Yes.
question is, about, Heschel said this his march in Selma with Dr. King,
Yes.
for
Yes.
equal
Yes,
rights
he did.
for Afro-American. So now it's time for, I think, Jews to also, in Israel also, around the world, to take a step for equal rights for Palestinians.
This is a complex subject, but it's a good one. I couldn't agree with you more. First of all, I say two things. There are many, many Jewish Israelis who agree with you completely. There are movements in Israel that way. Alas, particularly in the last 20 years, that movement has become overshadowed by a movement that for which the symbol in my mind is Benjamin Netanyahu. And there are a number of different arguments that I could give if I had a conversation with Netanyahu. Believe me, I don't have conversations with him. I'm not important enough. But if I had, there are two things I could say. One is just a general human issue. How do you deal with other human beings, period, right? And what he was doing and what is being done is clearly a negation of proper human treatment of other humans. But if I want to be specifically Jewish, then I say to someone like Benjamin Netanyahu, read your own texts. What you are doing contradicts those texts. So I can't agree with you more. But alas, as you know, the whole history of religion is that it has always been interwoven with politics. Politics has to do with the human ego. And again and again and again across human time and space, we find governments and political organizations that contradict the principles that they claim to be part of, that are at the heart of their religions. And the laundry list goes on and on and on where we see that happen. You know, you have this wonderful passage talking about Charlemagne, when in the 8th century, he conquered some German tribes and they were turned to Christianity. And the description in the biography says, I don't want to misquote it, but it's something like, you know, he went out and he slaughtered many of them and then brought them into the gentle yoke of Christianity. So the writer sees no contradiction between the fact that Christianity is promoted as a religion of love, and the way I convince you to become a Christian is by slaughtering you if I can't convince you with my words. And that's just one example. And we can see it across time and space, alas, again and again. I don't think any human group is free of that. And it's disturbing. And where the Israelis and the Palestinians are concerned, it is enormously disturbing to me. So you will forgive me. I need to go to my next engagement. I hate this because I would love to stay and hear the other speakers and participate more fully. So I apologize, but thank you. And thank you, Ananta. Thank you for having me.
Professor Soltis. As always, your invitation of critical thinking philosophy always motivates us to engage things deeply. And thank you so much for your generosity, and you really beautifully presented the idea. So,
thank you so much.
Dear and respected friend, now it's time to invite our next friend, Professor John Clammer. Professor John Clammer does not need any introduction at all. He's a good soul and great mind with pure heart. And his sociological imagination is beyond the word of explainable. You know, it is very, very important to understand. His thought is very, very deep and touching. So now I would like to request Professor John Clammer to kindly present his presentation. Yes, sir, over to you.
Okay, thank you once again. And nice to be back at this forum. Become something of a Sunday night regular feature of life, I think, in a way. And I'm sorry Ori has had to go. I've been very happy to have dialogue with him too about some of
this. Yes, he just sent me a message that please record the session and please send me on email ID.
So we can, yes, we can communicate at least that way, I hope. But thank you in your absence, Ori. I know with this incredible time difference between the US and India, it's always difficult for him, but loyally he's appeared in lots of these sessions. And I think he's given a very wonderful, in a sense, theological introduction to this notion of Sabbath. And I want to build on that in a rather different direction, which is the contemporary significance of this idea, of this practice. You know, the notion of Sabbath, of course, is related, I mean, both historically and linguistically, of course, to a word that all of us academics love to hear, which is the word sabbatical. You know, the idea, of course, that every 7th year, there should be not a complete cessation of activity, but at least a kind of diminution, in an attempt to like recharge, rethink, reflect, in which the busyness of daily life often prevents us from doing. And of course, the very wonderful idea, which I'm sure you're aware of the so-called Jubilee, notably that every seventh, there should be a complete cessation. All debts should be forgiven, slaves should be freed, the land should be left fallow, and so forth, which is a wonderful idea. I don't think it's ever been actually practiced anywhere. But comes from this idea. It comes from the kind of theological basis that Ori talked about. And indeed, this notion of the Sabbath as a kind of a bride. Any of you have the opportunity, I know Ananta has, at least once, attended the service in a synagogue on the Sabbath Eve, or the beginning of the Sabbath. As Ori said, the Sabbath actually begins at sunset on Friday, ends 1 hour after sunset on Saturdays, according to the conventional calendar. And there is a point in the Sabbath Eve service in which everyone in the congregation in the synagogue will turn towards the door or doors, wherever they are, to welcome the Sabbath bride, to symbolically welcome the Sabbath as if it was the entrance of a bride coming to her own wedding. A rather beautiful kind of image. But as always pointed out, I mean, these initial ideas began way back. I mean, these ideas have persisted for probably at least 3,000 years. And the question arises, therefore, of its kind of contemporary relevance. I mean, is this just something of historical interest to, theologians or scholars of religion, or, can we find something of, contemporary practical significance here? And I think we can. And let me tell you what some of those things are. But this key idea of this, as Ori pointed out, not this negative idea of like doing nothing. Sometimes I think we all need to do that, right, to recharge a little. But this positive idea of recharging ourselves and the environment around us. And I think as we're going to think about the contemporary significance of this idea of Sabbath, there are many ideas, but let me just pick out 3 or 4 which strike me as being extremely significant. One of the things, of course, as Ori said, that you do not, if you are practicing Sabbath observance, of course, you do not use or spend or even touch money on the Sabbath day. And this seems to me a very significant idea. In a society in which money seems to dominate so many relationships, personal relationships, activities of consumption. Imagine the idea that I think, I don't know if he's Scottish, has a Scottish name, a man called J.B. McKinnon, written a very nice book. Anybody wants to track it down? The book is called The Day the World Stopped Shopping, right? The Day the World Stopped Shopping. And what the book is about is the fact that, of course, so many of us are indeed caught up in this endless cycle of consumption, spending, getting in order to spend, that if we could cease from that, and I mean, in the, he talks about the whole nature of contemporary consumption in that book, but the key idea embodied in the title of that book is, in fact, a very Sabbath kind of idea. The day the world stopped shopping. Imagine a day in which people really don't go out and spend money, don't buy things, don't understand their identity in terms of their acquiring more stuff. Quite a radical idea, in fact, in a society so committed to consumption that the cessation of consumption itself becomes a kind of spiritual good in a way, I think, because it distances us from that kind of activity, makes us stop and reflect on it. What are we doing? Why are we so tied into the idea of money? And in fact, money itself is a very odd thing. If you think about it, it's a bit like the concept of time, which is very much tied up, as we've seen, with this idea of Sabbath. We all use money, we all spend money, we all acquire money, hopefully for our salaries and so on. It's very hard to define. What exactly is it? What does it do? Where does it come from? Where does value derive from? And actually, it's quite difficult to answer those questions. So, to separate ourselves even briefly, if it was 1 day a week, from that activity of buying and spending, of getting, of consuming, can be in fact very liberating. I think partly because we could and might begin to reflect on the idea of why in fact we are so dependent on things, on gadgets, on stuff, and discover in fact that we don't have to be, that dependency is something we've generated for ourselves, and it's not at all inherent in the human condition. So that separating ourselves from consumption seems to be one of the very important contemporary dimensions of Sabbath observance. A second is in relation to relationships. Now, it depends where you are on the kind of spectrum of Jewish practice and belief. It's not one thing. I mean, there's a whole spectrum ranging from what I always think of kind of right wing, the ultra orthodox people on the one hand, right across the spectrum through what is sometimes called conservative Judaism, through Reform Judaism, which really began to flourish in the 19th century, paradoxically, given the history, primarily in Germany, in the German-speaking world, and right across to what I think is the kind of the left wing, as it were, of what is sometimes called liberal Judaism. And within this, there's variation of practices. Amongst the very orthodox, for example, the prohibition on lighting of fire is understood to extend even to switching on lights or using electrical devices. And in fact, in my parents' day, many Jewish households, also called cheating slightly, would employ a Gentile, would employ what was sometimes called a Shabbat Goy, a Gentile who would come to your house on the Sabbath morning, turn on lights, light the fire in winter, this kind of stuff. So kind of did it for you. And I always thought that was cheating a bit. I mean, if you're not going to have lights, well, then I guess you don't have lights, period. But some people, of course, would extend this to the use of all sorts of things like our electronic devices. I haven't had a particularly busy day today, even though it's a Sunday, and I've been basically online from about 8 o'clock this morning until now. I'm still online, obviously. And my apartment has a nice balcony. It looks down over a kind of grassy area in the center of the housing colony where I live. And we have a little swimming pool, paddling pool. And what I often notice if I'm, lazily peering over the edge of my balcony in the evenings is the number of parents walking about, exercising their toddlers, their very small children in the, early evening, holding the child's hand with one hand, and in the other hand, I would say that about 90, I haven't done a survey, right? But I would think 80 to 90% of the parents I see are holding an electronic device in the other hand. They can't even take their small child out for a walk or to the paddling pool without taking their phone or their tablet, whatever, with them. I'm sure they're all terribly important people. The Prime Minister might call at any moment, but it's quite clear that there is an addiction to this kind of electronic device. No, it's profoundly useful. I mean, I couldn't have got through almost any of the things I've done today without access to a computer and to a smartphone, to the internet. But I find it disturbing when I see people addicted to this kind of electronic device, even on the context in which they're taking a walk. I see people jogging with their phone. Or what I find particularly disturbing is this idea of taking your small child out and not really paying attention to the child. You're too busy looking at your phone or whatever is on those phones. I often wonder what is so distracting. So in other words, we have a question of relationships here. And of course, one of the qualities of traditional Sabbath observance is that it is a time of relationality between the people who are sharing the Sabbath experience, whether at home or then, traditionally, of course, going out to the synagogue, becoming a member of an assembly, of a congregation. It's a time when, in the absence of all those distractions, there is time actually to reflect on the quality of relationships themselves. And I find that's a very profound idea in the contemporary world, because primarily actually of this addiction to electronic devices, but other things too, just simply busyness, overwork, coming home late from the office, any of those kind of things can often come between one person, of course, and the quality of their relationships to their spouse, to their children, to friends, to significant people in their lives, because then they don't have time. But as Ori and as Abraham Heschel pointed out, this very wonderful idea of the Sabbath as being a kind of oasis in time, a time when time doesn't stop, but that rush of normal time is suspended temporarily. So that's just my second thing. A third thing is much bigger than the individual, which is ecology. Now imagine, we know the kind of damage as a species we tend to be doing to the environment. Even one day a week, when we desist from damaging nature, trying to change nature, digging things up, cutting things down, plowing things up, whatever is involved, seems to me also profoundly healing for nature as a whole. And as Ori said, in the very traditional understanding of the Sabbath, even your animals should rest on Sabbath. Your camels, your whatever you have, your horses, your water buffalo, and so on, they need a day off too. They need rest. They need a time to recuperate. And for all we know, they need time to be together with other members of their own species. Most animals have a social life, if you forget. So I think a very profound current interpretation of the Sabbath is indeed this idea of letting nature rest. As I say, desisting from attempting to transform it in any way, allowing it simply to be itself, even if for one day, at least it creates a space in which regeneration can take place, which destruction does not proceed, right? And in which nature is really allowed to, in a sense, breathe. My last example, the relevance, as it were, contemporary relevance of the Sabbath is, it's a question we can ask ourselves here. I do know people, I'm sure you know people, and maybe you're even one of those people, can't be quiet. If they suddenly find they have a day with like nothing to do, they get quite disturbed. What do I get no real activity, nothing to do. You can't maybe go out, maybe you don't play sport, you don't do these things, you don't turn on the television, because that, if you follow that form of teaching, that will violate the idea of not kindling a light, which includes electricity in the view of many Orthodox Jews. It forces you back on yourself. And I think that is a healthy process, not in an egoistic kind of way, but the being forced to think about your own nature, the direction of your own life, the nature of the values that you should be pursuing, maybe are not. And I think a lot of this is what is actually captured by this very slippery term, spirituality. That one of the functions of the Sabbath, of course, and again, you wouldn't have to be Orthodox to do this. You might go to the synagogue on Friday night for the eve, the opening, the beginning of the Sabbath service. You go home for the Sabbath evening meal, and the Sabbath evening meal is opened by a wonderful little ceremony in which the woman of the house lights the Sabbath candles, and in lighting them says a prayer which is to welcome and to introduce the Sabbath. And again, that's a very feminine thing. It's normally the wife, daughter, whatever adult woman is present who is responsible for the lighting of the Sabbath candle. And I always think that's a rather very beautiful moment when that happens. So this does in fact create a space in which, if the Sabbath services themselves, perhaps again on Saturday morning, when the Torah, the portions of the Bible are read and commented on, usually by the rabbi in his or her sermon, is the occasion on which, being taken out of the world of everyday noise and distractions, force us back to think of those kind of fundamental values, which everyday life seems to conspire very often to prevent us from doing. It's just too busy, too much noise, too much going on. Some analysts, some scholars of religion tend to divide religions into two broad categories. On the one hand, what is sometimes called orthodoxy. On the other hand, what is called orthopraxis. Christianity, particularly in its Protestant version, forms, is a classic example of orthodoxy. It's a question, let us say, of right belief. So for many evangelical Christians, of course, the way you become saved is to believe in Jesus as your savior. What you do is not necessarily attached to this. And I know this is an argument that goes on amongst Christian theologians, since, of course, there is one book in the Christian portion of the Bible, the book of James, which contests that idea to some extent. It says, well, this is okay up to a point, but if you profess something and don't do it, the example I think that Ori gave at the end, I can kill people who refuse to convert to my religion, and the ones who finally give up their arms and so on, then I can convert them without seeing any contradiction between violence and inflicting death on other people, and apparently the belief in a religion of love. And as the book of James in the Bible, in the Christian part of the Bible, points out, that there's a kind of contradiction there. Practice and belief should go together. And one of the features of many features of Judaism is that it rather falls into that second category of what is known as orthopraxis. That is to say, very few people are going to ask you actually what you believe in. Can you define a set of beliefs of a creed, as it were, which many forms of Christianity, Anglican Christianity, for example, has a creed, which is supposed to define the core beliefs which you're supposed to adhere to, if indeed you claim to be a Christian, or certainly a Christian of that sect or variety, as it were. Whereas that question rarely comes up in Judaism. What people are more likely to look at is what you do, not what you claim to believe in. And that doing can have two aspects. It can, of course, apply, as again Ori was suggesting, to moral practice, which is probably the key, but also, of course, to the practice of religious observances. That what I see you doing is withdrawing from the noise and rush of the world for one day and actually practicing the things you should do on the Sabbath, saying not in this negative way of doing nothing, but finding that space of renewal, which is what it's supposed to be. This is not unique to Judaism, of course. Whenever I think of Buddhism here, I often think of the idea of right practice. And that notion of right practice seems to me to be actually a very good way of defining many aspects of Jewish practice, which are not separate from belief, of course, but express it in ways which are integral to that belief. So therefore, I mean, in other examples, if one claimed to be an adherent of a religion which puts love at its center, then to behave in unloving ways puts you into a deep contradiction. And that contradiction is really an unacceptable one. And I think in Judaism, and the Sabbath seems to be a very, very good example of an attempt to do something to do this in practice, is by taking you out of the world, in a sense, for one day, gives you a perspective on the rest of that world, on that 6 days that follow or preceded the Sabbath. And that, I think, is a very vital idea. I mean, in academic life, I've only had maybe 1.5 or something like this sabbaticals, in the academic sense, when you can leave your teaching, your administrative work and this kind of thing, and actually spend a year reflecting, developing your work, doing those kind of things. That's a real luxury. But to have that kind of mini sabbatical once a year seems to me, rather than being a burden, it seems to me to be something we should actively cultivate. Something which gives us a perspective on life and gives us a way of withdrawing for that 25 hours from the hurdy-burdy of life to look back on the rest of life and to think about what shape we really think that life should take for ourselves. Okay, I think that's quite enough from me. So thank you so much. I hope that's been helpful. And again, if anybody has any questions, I'm of course delighted to try to answer them.
Thank you, John Clammer, as always, very, very deep and so touchy. And, Dear and respected friend, if you have any question, please indicate me in the chat box. Meanwhile, we can invite our friend Anantagri. Are you comfortable to speak right now, or you need some time to present your presentation? Okay, he's taking some time. So, Gyan Gului, you are cordially invited to share your thought and observation.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it was very interesting, both contributions. I would say that as far as I know of Rabbi Heschel, and as far as I could hear in the unfortunately not very many lessons which have remained from by him, for instance, on YouTube, that when he speaks of the meaning of Shabbos, of Sabbath, he many times insists on the, so to speak, on the necessity of Sabbath, in order that the individual is not taken over by the activities of, he calls them the activities in space, and he differentiates many times the dimension of space, which seems to see for him like it looks like a dimension of dispersion of the individual in the different activities, and perhaps also in the dimension of individualism, of egoism, but not necessarily in a negative dimension. Anyway, it's rather a sort of dimension, that of space, of the 6 weeks, not of the Sabbath, in which the individual is, so to speak, absorbed in different activities which, so to speak, compromise is unity, is psychological unity, and that the Shabbos represents something like a coming back to himself or to herself, for the individual, for any individual. To himself means, of course, also to the center of the family, to the effects, to the relation with other people, which are not dictated by this dimension of activity, of the usual activity, but which are dictated more by a dimension of spirituality, comprehension, reciprocal help, and so also of meditation about oneself and about the relationship of oneself with the other people. So as far as I have understood of the thought of Rabbi Heschel about the meaning of Sabbath, I was impressed by this separation of Sabbath in the dimension of time, and in the, of course, in the expectation of the Sabbath and of this day, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, by the, so to speak, by the dispersion in the different activities. He makes him always this differentiation between time of Sabbath and, on the other hand, spaces of the other 6 days. And so in this, I was impressed by this conception of the coming back and of the necessity of the coming back of the individual to a dimension of, for him, for Rabbi Heschel, of spirituality, and of the necessity of being at least one day of the week far from the dimension of the spatiality, which for him means also, so to speak, a dispersion in the activities. So this is the point which most impressed me, hearing at his lessons. Unfortunately, as said, there are not many lessons which I could find in YouTube and in other channels, and in his writings. So this is so separation between the activities on the one hand and the the rediscovery every week of the dimension of time, which means effects, which means connections with other people, and a meditation about oneself, the necessity of the suspension in relation to the different activities of the common life. So this is what I would underline of his thought. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Gyanabulu. As always, very deep and insightful question. Yes, Professor Giri,
Yes.
please present your presentation, and then we will take some
So,
questions.
dear friends, hello, John. Nice listening to you. And already we have worked and meditated with many aspects of the meaning of Sabbath, and John has helped us to be with Sabbath in our contemporary times in manifold ways. And one out of many things that Heschel talks about is an intuitive understanding of eternity. That how being with Sabbath in this time, we get an intuition of eternity. And that brings us to that how the time of Sabbath is a bridge between the time that we are and eternity. And let me quickly present a few thoughts that I had got from Abraham. Can I share the screen, please? Let's share the screen. Randhir, could you enable me to share the screen?
Yes, yes. Just give me a minute. I have to just again. Yes, now you can share the screen.
Posted disabled, it says, participant screen sharing.
Please
Otherwise,
try again.
okay.
Please try again.
So this is from how to share. Select a window. Okay, how to share, please?
Okay, okay, no problem. I have your presentation. Let me share. Okay.
So this intuition of eternity that Heschel talks about, Sabbath, it also can be related to Sri Aurobindo, where he is speaking in Savitri, that we have to reveal our hidden eternities. And once we are with time in this way, I'll go to the last one. Yes, this one. In the beginning, I was telling about how being with time, we can cultivate a pregnant time. So we can relate to Sabbath as a time of pregnancy. And no wonder that Ori told us how in Sabbath also the physical union between couple, so that gets a sacred character. But space also, it is not just a question of total denial of space, how also create space as a pregnant space, how do we divinize space? And age in our present day world, as John was saying, we live in a moment of busyness. What David Harvey talks about space-time compression. So in this period of space-time compression, being with Sabbath, it gives us a new art and yoga of space-time expansion and deepening. So we deepen space and time and realizing our own hidden eternities, realizing the hidden eternities of fellow beings. It gives us a realization of vastitude, that we are much more than things, we are much more than slave to our routine. Then going back to the first paragraphs, so friends who may not have a chance to read Heschel, I just present a few of his lines. You can go to the beginning, please. Where he's talking about how, for example, being with Sabbath is a craft, it is not just labor. Okay, as it is coming, he's saying to enhance our power in the world of space is our main objective, yet to have more does not mean to be more. That is a crucial thing. To have more does not mean to be more. How do we become what we want to become? Then another line is selling himself into slavery to things, man becomes a utensil that is broken at the fountain. And another line from him, the result of our thinginess is our blindness to all reality that fails to identify itself as a thing, as a matter of fact. Ori has touched upon this. The higher goal of spiritual life, he writes, is not to amass a wealth of information, but to face sacred moments. And facing sacred moments, also being with sacred moments, and also being with moment in a sacred way. And he goes on to say the Bible is more concerned with time than with space, that Ori has touched about. And he again goes on to say Judaism teaches us to be attached to holiness in time, to be attached to sacred events, to learn how to consecrate sanctuaries that emerge from the magnificent stream of a year. The Sabbaths are our great cathedrals, and our Holy of Holies is a shrine that neither the Romans nor the Germans were able to burn. And he goes on to say, Jewish ritual may be characterized as the art of significant forms in time, as architecture of time. Labor is a craft, but perfect rest is an art. And as John was saying, really, we do not know, because once we have a day free, then we become too anxiety ridden. So perfect rest, how do we take rest? How do we be with leisure? Because what is happening, as John was referring to, when the day that the world stopped shopping. So do we know what to do in a day where there is nothing to do except shopping or watching television or going on a vacation? So therefore, yes, we are waiting for rest at leisurely time. But what is our idea of being with leisurely time? Is it again putting that leisurely time to the whole machinery of the other day of enjoyment, of industry, or do we want to use it as a time to discover ourselves, to discover each other, to discover the sacredness or holiness and wholeness, holiness and holiness that is within and across? And another very important line from his book, but man does not live by bread and circus games alone. Who will teach him how to desire anxiously the spirit of a sacred day. So, dear friends, so these are some lines from Joshua Heschel that I thought I will present to you, including linking it with the journey of eternity and vastitude. So I invite other friends to kindly share their thoughts. I see Dr. Janel Singh Anand also. Randhir, we can.
Yes, we can see Janel Singh Anand and Sabir Ahmed Bhatji and Angel Elizabeth. Uh, we are cordially invited all our discussant or the participant to present some thoughts. Meanwhile, I have also one query about the question of epistemic humility. I think somewhere we found in the writing of Abraham Joshua, where he talks about the problem to be faced is how to combine loyalty to one's own tradition with reverence for different traditions. So, and we need to also invite thinkers like Abraham Joshua to inculcate a kind of trend or philosophy of interdialogue, because when he talks about listening to one another, going beyond the confines of space where we feel most secure, that is the path towards rightness. But unfortunately, on Sabbath, there is another thinker from called Ahad Aham, who famously said that more than Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews. So a kind of orthodoxy which we need to understand today. So and also I want to know in what manner Sabbath try to answer the question that how do you feel yourself to be a part of something greater when you are alone. So Professor Saltus also talked about that somewhere there is this connotation is there in the song. So a respected friend, I would like to invite some more point. So Miniti ji, please share some of your observation. Minti ji is taking some time. So I would request Professor John Clammer to respond to some of the concern.
Well, there are a lot of issues here. You raised some interesting questions, and Ananta just did. And though, let me just throw in maybe two ideas. This question about, in a way, perceiving sacredness. I mean, I think some people, perhaps people who are more mystic or bent, are more attuned to this anyway. You know, they can, in the middle of everyday noisy life, they're still aware of those aspects. But it's true that, busy daily life tends to drive some of those things to the edge, to the periphery of our attention. And finding devices that bring back attentiveness to the sacred are, I think, therefore very important. And of course, different religious traditions have different ways of doing this. In Buddhism, particularly, meditation is, I guess, the primary way in which that will be done. And meditation does exist in other traditions too. I mean, in the mystical traditions, there's a whole story here about the mystical dimensions of Judaism, which is perhaps not so well known, where forms of meditation also occur. But for regular people, for everyday people who can't withdraw themselves from the world, it's important to find this kind of time in which those other distractions are set apart, in which that sense of the sacred perhaps can arise. And I would mention two aspects of this too. It's particularly important. Unlike in Christianity, there's no tradition of monasticism, or Buddhism. There's no tradition of monasticism in Judaism. There are no monks. Okay, so basically, there's no group of people, no sector of the belief community who withdraw from the world in order to kind of specialize in developing their spiritual faculties. There's no such thing. In fact, certainly in contemporary Buddhism, there are no priests. There were historically, of course, priests who served the temple cult. And if you know anybody of Jewish descent whose surname is Cohen, or one of its very slightly different spellings, Cohen, whatever, they are in fact descendants of that priestly sect. And there are certain occasions on which certain events, such as the reading of the Torah, the reading of the scriptures, is not possible without two things. One being that there should be a quorum, there should be 10 adult Jewish people present. And in the liberal tradition, that 10 can be comprised of either gender. In conservative Buddhism, it usually is 10 men, but that's another story, okay? And even the notion of rabbi, I mean, the word rabbi in Hebrew simply means teacher. So the rabbi who has, in a sense, priestly functions is not a priest in say the Christian or Hindu sense of the term at all, which means that the responsibility for, if you like, this search for the sacred is pushed back on every individual. There are no mediators in the sense of people who perform those sacred functions for you. There's no such thing. You have to do it yourself. So this creates two things, I think. I mean, one's a sense of responsibility for undertaking this search, and the other is a very profound sense of autonomy, that it's up to you, not in a sense that makes you feel lonely. Oh my goodness, I don't have some priest here who will, carry out the ritual on my behalf, as it were. The closest you get to that actually is not strictly to do with the Sabbath itself, but is the idea that one of the most sacred duties is in fact the close study of the scriptures, and that activity itself. And in a yeshiva, in a religious school, religious college in Judaism, that is in fact the primary activity, is examining closely and debating the significance of the scriptures. But that's not expressed, that's a very democratic activity, although there can be teachers, of course, who have some higher grasp of language and kind of theological issues involved, okay? But what I'm really pointing out is simply two things. One, I think, is that one of the functions of the Sabbath is to help us to that sense of attention, of stopping and looking at the world and really thinking about what we see, what it means. And the other is the fact that it's pushed back on the individual who has to do this. There's no priest to mediate. It's a search which is paradoxically both individual in that sense, but also very communal in the sense that, of course, you're part of a community of interpretation. Whether it's the members of your synagogue, members of your yeshiva, your religious college or school, or Judaism as a whole, you're not cut off from that resource. Far from it, there's constant dialogue, of course, that goes on within the community. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but it does suggest that with the concept of the Sabbath, you do have a way of thinking about creating a space in which the kind of numinous, the sacred quality of everyday things can appear. And let me just add one little point to that, which gets not into with the Sabbath. I mean, most people are aware of the idea of keeping kosher, the Jewish practice, which is very close to that of halal practice, of course, in Islam. And what's this for? I mean, why have all these rules about what you eat, when you eat? Some of them are very practical, by the way. I mean, one of the rules of kosher eating is you do not mix meat and milk products at the same meal. Then, well, why not? The answer is actually biological. Meat and milk are digested by quite different enzymes. So if you eat beef or mutton or something and then drink a glass of milk, you're really confusing your tummy because the enzymes don't know what to do because they've got two totally contradictory things coming down at the same time, right? But the biological dimension is probably important, but it's not the main function. The main function is of the notion of kosher is to draw your attention to the fact that, in a sense, everything is sacred. Everything in the everyday is sacred. So what you eat should be a subject of that kind of meditation. What am I eating? Why am I eating it? Why do I have certain rules about what can be eaten, what cannot be eaten? Not as a set of prohibitions, but as a set of rules which direct your attention to the sacredness of the everyday, including, of course, a very important, very vital aspect of our diet. Hey, thank you.
Thank you, John Clammer.
Thank you, John and Randhir. Maybe I can join into your question about dialogue and listening. It seems that relating to what John is helping us to understand attention, because attention and listening are together. And in fact, when we are not too crowded, when we are not too busy, then there is a possibility, the time to really listen. So in a way, Sabbath is also a day of time of listening, and it is that attentive moment. It is also a fertile time for dialogue. So therefore, to have dialogue, to really cultivate a space of time of dialogue, we need to really free ourselves from many entanglements, as Sabbath says. So there is a link between Sabbath and dialogue in this way. And so, our time when we are withdrawing ourselves from many kinds of entanglement, and we are attentive to, so we can listen to ourselves, listen to the other, and so a dialogue, many dialogues are possible.
Yes, thank you. So we are also running out of the time. So we can invite, Angle Elizabeth and Minitiji. I think she's taking some time. So thank you so much, and we are grateful. Yes, Professor Giri, you want to say something?
No, just joining you. That yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, and thank you, dear and respected friend. Thank you so much for your kind representation and participation, especially Professor Saltus and John Clammer, as always, very enriching, so deep. And I thank you so much, Gyan Buluiji, and Elizabeth, Milti Pradhan ji, and Professor Ananta. Thank you so much.
And,
so good night.
John,
Hope
and John, we look forward
John
to meet you tomorrow morning here together.
About 8:15.
Yes.
My driver's coming at 8. About 8:15. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at University.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Good night, everyone.